Sunday, April 3rd, 2022. I'm Anthony Davis, and welcome to the 8th episode in this series from Midas Touch and 5-Minute News called The Weekend Show. Download the show as audio in addition to my daily 5-Minute News podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today is Executive Editor of Rewire News Group and co-host of the podcast Boom Lawyered, Jessica Pieklo. Hi, Jessica. Thank you very much for joining us here on The Weekend Show. We've got lots to talk about. I don't know if you found this. For me this week, I'm literally, you see, I've already pulled all my hair out, but I've literally pulled my hair out because it's as if, the war in Ukraine weighs very heavily on my chest, and I'm sure it's the same for you. Yes. I feel very helpless, and there's very little we can do on this side of the world other than pray, I guess. But I also feel like a combination of things, the knock-on effect of that with gas prices over here and how Biden's choosing to handle that. We've got the January 6 panel who are just pushing all the time. And I think Jared Kushner sat and had a good chat with them this week. Mm-hmm. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that conversation. And so we're going to look at some of these stories, all of which we've covered in 5-Minute News across the week. And then the other one is, of course, Arizona. The governor there has signed bills limiting transgender rights and abortion in that state as well, following on from Florida and Texas. So these are things that we're going to discuss, sharing your expertise. Let's look at Merrick Garland to start with. Mm-hmm. This is because of the lawmakers investigating the insurrection are increasingly going public with critical statements, court filings, and more to deliver a blunt message to the Attorney General Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice. Of course, they can't suggest any crimes. Well, they can suggest that crimes may have been committed, but they can't prosecute. They have to refer it to the Justice Department. So what do you think of this guy, Merrick Garland? Because, he's made some very moving speeches. He's obviously very emotionally involved in all of these cases, isn't he? And I respect him for that. But is he going to come through here? Is he going to allow American democracy to survive going forward, or is he just going to drop the ball? What are your thoughts?
Wow, we're opening up with a light question, I see.
I apologize.
No, but truly, first of all, thank you for having me on. But that's really, I think, the question at the heart of the January 6th Commission and a lot of people's minds moving forward right now. So first, some context. The Department of Justice has been moving forward on many of these prosecutions. And as a former litigator, these things take time. For example, even in some of the document requests around Rudy Giuliani, for example, Giuliani's lawyers have been fighting those requests from the Department of Justice for months and months and months and months. And we're just getting rulings on those now. That's not to give any excuses or to sort of, say that the Department of Justice can't be doing more, because I do think they could be doing more. In particular, Merrick Garland has a bully pulpit. So even if the Department of Justice is moving behind the scenes in litigation on these cases as they are, the fact that the Department of Justice, that our Attorney General has not been more vocally out there, I think, is also not helping. Right? Because it's as if it's sending a message that this is not important, or they don't really care that much. It's business as usual. And none of those things can be true if the democracy is to survive. The Department of Justice must care about these, investigating these cases, referring them for prosecution, but it does take time. The Watergate prosecutions, those took 3 years from that, little gap. We were talking about a, 17-minute gap in the Watergate tapes, or even less. And we've got a 7-hour gap now that we're learning about in presidential communications on January 6th. So part of that is the cliche that the wheels of justice move slowly. But that said, I do think that, particularly the administration and that Merrick Garland in particular, as the attorney not actually doing the prosecuting here, right? Those are his teams of attorneys behind him. He could be more vocal on this, because it then falls to Democratic members of Congress. And that also isn't a great look moving forward.
What happens to democracy in the meantime? Because, this is my greatest fear. And I've been watching a new documentary's just dropped on PBS, on a Frontline documentary. And as you know, they do great journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a long-form documentary. And this thing, I haven't finished it actually. I'm kind of halfway through it, but it's called "Plot to Overturn the Election," and it's a Frontline and ProPublica. They've teamed up to examine how lies about election fraud have made their way to the center of American politics, and how a handful of people have had an outsized impact on the current crisis of democratic legitimacy in the United States. And I fear that in Merrick Garland's silence, even people on the left are starting to say, well, yeah, democracy in America is flawed. The election wasn't fair. Is that not the problem of delaying the response? And I appreciate the investigation takes a long time, but so much damage, in my mind, is being done in the meantime.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's the danger of the silence, right? Even if imagine if we had periodic democracy updates from the Department of Justice in terms of how it was handling this response, just a periodic press briefing about, statuses on some of these cases, all of which is public information, but it's just difficult for journalists and folks to dig up, right? Like that's not necessarily easy, organic information to come by. So those are opportunities, in my opinion, that are low-hanging fruit for the Department of Justice that are missed. And to your point, what it's doing is it's creating a vacuum of opportunity, particularly on the right. We are seeing them increasingly embrace big lie as platform. I mean, we have this going into the midterm election, so much so that, we have the wife of a sitting Supreme Court Justice, Ginny Thomas, at the heart of this. Her husband is ruling on January 6th cases. And yet at the same time, the response from the left seems to be, well, we hope he does the right thing moving forward, as though, that's going to happen. So one of the other dangers, I think, is complacency among the left by Merrick Garland continuing to not really use that pulpit. What does it do? It just creates an opportunity for folks with bad intentions to control the narrative and also, operate behind the scenes. One of the concerns that I have, that I know other folks share, is that January 6th was a testing ground. Some of what we're seeing, particularly in my opinion, on these election lawsuits related to the voting machines and whatnot, we have seen bad faith actors on the right, regardless of the issue, use trial balloons, right, to do these things to see how far they can get away with, how much they can get away with. I am very concerned about what will happen with election integrity going beyond the midterm elections, since we seem to have this vacuum. Even if things are happening, it's not in the constant communication in political media, especially. And so I share a lot of those concerns right now.
Is this also a failure of Democrats? Because, the right are going to do their thing, and the machine behind this coup, just based on what I've seen of half of this Frontline documentary, there were dozens and dozens of people at a very high level, Michael Flynn, who were responsible for plotting a significant plot to overturn the election. This is what, clearly all led by Trump, but there had to be people who were making this happen. And so the more we discover about it, and the more that the January 6th Commission release information each week as they do, which is endlessly fascinating. But the reality is that these people that overturned, or they succeeded in overturning the election for a period of hours, because of course they delayed the certification. And to me, that's a successful coup.
Exactly.
Those people haven't retired. Those people are, if anything, they are more energized than ever. So is it a failure of the Democrats and of arguably the president? Because he's been very silent on this, to make us aware that American democracy is being protected through due process.
Absolutely. I think that's completely fair to lay part of this at the Democratic leadership's feet. They have an obligation to all of us, regardless of how they vote in their party. if our democratic ideals mean anything, this is the moment to be speaking to them and to be calling members of their coalition in, whether they're Democratic or Republican, because yes, this is a failure of Democrats in terms of continuously pushing the issue. It's also a failure of Democrats by not continuously putting this issue at the feet of their colleagues. All of the talk of bipartisanship should mean nothing when these are folks who were willing to ignore the will of the people, who were willing to stand by as a scaffolding was being erected for the former vice president, and then to proceed as business as normal. The fact that Democrats are even proceeding as business as normal, I think, is sending the wrong signal from the gates.
Not a solitary Republican voted for voting rights, the Voting Rights Act, right? The John
Right.
Lewis Act and the other. Not a single Republican. Now, should that not trigger, even in conservative voters, some feelings that actually the people who represent them do not have their best interests at heart? I mean, why is this not setting off more alarm bells for the greater population?
That's an excellent question. I wish I knew, because I have been freaking out about this for a
Me
good
too,
long
yeah.
while now. It should not be accepted that the Republican Party stands for opposition to voting writ large. Why that is accepted as okay and politics as normal, even when you see the framing around the failure of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, it was a loss for Democrats. No, that's a loss for democracy. It's not a loss for Democrats. And so there's a, political media failure there too, in just a willingness to accept the fight for democracy as a partisan fight. This should not be a partisan fight. We should have conservatives on the side of democracy, pushing out the folks who want to promote the big lie, who are looking to continue and upend voting rights and, free and fair elections. We have stood by in this country and been proud of the, nonviolent transfer of power that historically we have had. And I don't think we can say that anymore. And conservatives, for all of their grandstanding around the flag, around American values, this should be their moment more than even Democrats. And yet here we are. The battle for democracy is apparently a partisan issue.
But the Democrats screwed up, didn't they? Because they stacked those bills with too many things. There were too many aspects to those bills. In the same way that social care and climate bill was just stacked and packed. And it seems the only way to get Republicans to join in is to have one hot button issue, and just to do it, and infrastructure clearly was the only one that they were prepared to give, despite, Joe Manchin's negotiations, bringing it down from trillions to next to nothing.
Friends like these.
So is this, we have to look to blame somebody. And this coincides with Nancy Pelosi announcing that she's going to run again and continue. And she is responsible for packaging a lot of this policy, isn't she?
Mm-hmm.
She's the one who negotiates behind the scenes. She's the one that puts the bills together with her colleagues. And yet, and she's 146 now, right? So, she's obviously got a lot of experience, and I'm not criticizing her for that. But if it's the case that she has not been able to get any of these bills passed, why does she not have the radar to recognize that maybe she's not the right person for the job, and that actually somebody else who has a different perspective? Because arguably Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden are institutionalized. These people have grown up in the Senate. They've matured in the Senate and in Congress. And so you end up with people who cannot see the bigger picture. So who do we blame for the fact that voting rights didn't pass? You can't just blame Republicans for not voting for it.
No, I think we have a really interesting moment in our political establishment too. And I saw this particularly, the Judge Jackson confirmation hearings are fresh in my mind because I recently was just, up to my eyeballs covering them. And what we saw from the Democratic leadership in the Judiciary Committee, I think, is a split among the cohorts generationally. And I think what you are asking really gets to that, because I would put that failure at Chuck Schumer's feet as well, right? Like
Right.
really an inability of senior Democratic leadership to A, read the room, and then B, collect the votes, which was, Schumer's job in the Senate to work with what happened in the House. And so we are seeing a newer generation of Democratic leadership in both the House and the Senate come up and understand that this is a different political moment, that this is not the same political moment that Joe Biden, that Chuck Schumer, that Nancy Pelosi, that Dianne Feinstein's, that these
The
folks
dinosaurs, effectively, the dinosaurs.
The Democratic gerontocracy of
Yeah.
leadership. And I think it's okay to call it a gerontocracy of leadership. And folks do need to be able to know when to step aside and let new leadership in, new vision in. And this is the political moment to do so. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that in, that kind of self-reflection, that kind of understanding that it is more than a person's political career. But truly, this is something I think that is generational across the Democratic Party right now, the fight for the future of that leadership really is also about the fight for so many of these progressive policy issues that matter to us the most.
You need both teams to play by the rules, don't you? In order to get anything through. It's very, even in a game of soccer, there are basic rules.
Right.
And that's how you get to the end of the game. Otherwise, the game would never end. This game is never going to end because Joe Biden seems to think that he can make bipartisanship, the buzzword of the new millennia, and it's not happening. Republicans are done with the rules.
Yeah.
They are done with the rules of democracy. They are done with the rules of voting. They are done with the rules of committees, and they don't show up for stuff. They just don't bother.
Yeah.
So what's it going to take to make the old guard realize that they're just playing a different game to everybody else?
I wish I knew, because to continue your analogy, right? This is like the Republicans were off sides for an entire half, running up the score. And then the Democrats come in and are trying to level the game at that moment, right? And impossible to be done. You can't be done. It's good to hear some initial stabs at conversations around democracy reform, things like court reform. That's one of the areas that is of huge importance to me. I've been covering the federal judiciary as a journalist now for over a decade, for talking about the conservatives' plan, really politically, to capture the judiciary as part of a policy agenda for them and what that meant for this country. And folks are now starting to talk about that. I hope the January 6th commission and this Ginny Thomas business brings that conversation more to bear. But again, to your point, the leadership in the Democratic Party, the old guard leadership, the Biden administration, has said that these are all nice conversations to have, but it's not really interested in doing anything radical. We are in a moment that calls for radical action, and the younger generation understands that of leadership, and they are just gonna, I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah.
Absent the voters doing something in those really blue districts, right? Like absent Dianne Feinstein's constituents coming to her and saying, please, Senator Feinstein, don't run again. Absent, Nancy Pelosi's constituents coming to her and say, please, Representative Pelosi, there is somebody new who should have this seat. Like, I don't really know, because there is no incentive absent personal goodwill for these folks to step aside.
I've been working with a producer in the last week, Sarah, a young woman, really very inspiring. And I was talking to her about, Joe Biden. And she said she wished that Joe Biden could be as radical as Donald Trump was on the right, but with progressive ideas. That kind of, and I thought it was beautiful, because it's so simple. This notion that to be radical is not to be bad. Yeah. And of course, we paint, and the Republicans have painted anybody who comes close to what they describe as radical, AOC, Ilhan Omar, any of these people that don't fit their perfect narrative. they just, even Bernie Sanders, they describe as radical. Yeah, I'm from England, and none of this stuff is considered radical. The Green New Deal is standard. It's just normal. This is what you do.
Right.
And so how do we, is it just that Biden is the wrong guy? Because, he said that he wants to run again. He only said that a week or so ago, and with Kamala Harris as his running mate. But the reality is that if Biden runs, and I hate to say this out loud because I fear that it may come true. I'm looking for some wood to touch, but I don't think I have any here. But I think that if he ran against Donald Trump will win, and Donald Trump will become the president. And whether that's through fraud, or whether it's through cheating or whatever, it's irrelevant. The point is that Trump will come back.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I don't really, it's not even a question. I'm just like, I just think it's important to remind ourselves that Trump is not history.
No.
And this benign activity of the current president, it is not enough to stop an autocrat from cheating, right?
No, it's not. And this is, sort of getting back to the start of our conversation in terms of Democratic failures here. We know that Trump will come back and run again. And even if he doesn't, we know that those affiliated with him will be surrounding themselves with whoever is the Trump stand-in. This is not going away. This is the conservative movement in the United States, to be very clear. All of the religious evangelical leaders were recently at Mar-a-Lago huddling together for the run. If folks think that the, conservative political establishment isn't still fully with the former president of the United States, they are mistaken. They are. I just don't think Democrats, and honestly, I don't think a lot of folks who consider themselves pretty savvy political consumers take the Trump threat in 2024 seriously, and definitely not seriously enough. They want power. That's what this is about. This isn't about governing principles. This isn't about instituting a specific set of policy ideals. We're no longer having conversations in any good faith way with conservatives about an opposition to tax policy, even foreign policy is all wrapped up in this sense of just grabbing power and staying in power. And Democrats don't say that about the opposition, but they have to, because that's what it is.
This has been reported recently, hasn't it? Democrats' inability to actually critique the other side, to say what we're all seeing. Now, where does that stem from? Because I haven't lived in the US for long enough to kind of understand what the culture is behind this. What is the reason that they're so stuck on the kind of respectful protocol of Congress? Is that what it is?
Some of it, I do think, is the sense of the esteemed traditions of democracy that come, and folks buy into that. There is absolutely the reality that the folks who have spent their lifetime in Congress don't necessarily see the world the way that those of us who live in it do. That's just the truth. And I also think that there is, quite frankly, a racial layer to this too. The United States Congress is exceptionally white and has been historically. And white culture in this country does not like to make a scene or be rude. And I think that is in part an extension of it. I frankly would love to see a brawl like some of the parliament stuff, actually get into it. I'm saying that kind of kidding, but also really kind of not, because at least there is the power of conviction, right? For good or for bad, it's messy, and is it great?
Well, it's referred to as debate, isn't it? We debate in Parliament on a Wednesday at noon. In Parliament in England, we that they have Prime Minister's questions and they go back and forth. But Congress doesn't have that. The Senate doesn't have that. They make a series of statements. They don't address each other directly. There is no interplay. There is no volley. And therefore, there is no debate. And yet they use the word debate. Oh, we'll debate this, we'll debate that.
Yeah.
But I have never seen a debate. I'm still waiting for one. So, is that the fundamental problem, that it's all theatre? It is a theatrical display. It's a little bit like, I was talking to somebody yesterday who's a friend of mine who's also a Trump supporter, my only Trump supporter who's a friend, and I find him completely fascinating. You know, I'm like mining him for information of like, what on earth is he thinking? And he just says, oh, well, you know, the news is entertainment. And he said that genuinely. Oh, well, the news is entertainment. So how do we dilute or marginalize what is fundamentally so important? I mean, is that really the bigger picture conversation, that politics is just show business for ugly people? And that we are, you know, and that democracy, the fall of democracy in the West, it doesn't really matter because it's, you know, it's the Truman Show. It's, you know, there's a director and there's everyone's an actor. I mean, is that in the back of Americans' minds that actually none of this matters because American exceptionalism means life will go on?
I think there is some truth to that. You know, Mark Twain certainly before the Truman Show would have said that was the direction of American politics from its inception. Even, you know, Molly Ivins. I mean, we have such a great history of political satirists in this country that I think that there has to be some truth to the idea that politics is entertainment and theater too. I do push back against that a little bit because it does matter ultimately, you know, as a woman who is witnessing the rapid rollback of reproductive rights in this country in a space that as a journalist I've covered for over a decade. And the backlash here is something that while I was anticipating it is even quicker than I was anticipating. It does matter. These fights do matter because what ultimately is the outcome impacts me and my community differently than it does other communities also. So, you know, the theater is part of it, absolutely. But real people's lives are on the line in these policy debates. And so if we cave too much into that nihilism, I think if we cave too much into the idea that it's theater, then we really have crossed the Rubicon. And why bother on anything? Because then, you know, voting rights definitely won't get protected. You know, trans kids will definitely stay in the crosshairs of conservatives. All of those things will absolutely never change that way.
Let's stay on that subject because Arizona's Republican governor signed a series of bills on Wednesday this week targeting abortion and transgender rights, joining a growing list of GOP states that are pursuing a conservative social agenda. And, you know, this is outlawing abortion after 15 weeks if the U.S. Supreme Court allows it, prohibit gender confirmation surgery for minors. It'll ban transgender girls from playing on girls' sports teams. And we're seeing this now in multiple states, and it's only going to be extended, isn't it? And so, you know, there's always a victim here, isn't there? You know, the victim is not the white male, the white straight, you know, cis male that is making these rules, often without any kind of outreach, without any referenda. You know, there's not much. I mean, I would suggest if you were to survey the people, even in these Republican states, they don't want to ban abortion because half of them need to use those services. So let's just talk about the fact that these policies are not victimless, are they? And I know that you have a lot of expertise, especially when it comes to abortion rights. So, I mean, what direction is the country going in? And how would the rest of the world view America if you know, Roe v. Wade is overturned?
I mean, this is absolutely the direction that we're headed. And, you know, what does it mean to overturn Roe versus Wade? It means a lot more than the end of legal abortion in some states and potentially across the country. You know, one of the things that I really hope folks understand about the anti-abortion movement in this country is that they are not settled on half measures. They don't view something like a ban at 15 weeks as a win. They don't view abortion being outlawed in one state but accessible in another state as a win. Those aren't wins to them. There are no half measures. They will not be satisfied until abortion is recriminalized across the country. But it's even further than that. The laws that uphold the right to abortion uphold a whole host of privacy rights in this country that folks who may have personal opposition to abortion don't have the same personal opposition to. For example, birth control is very clearly on the line here. We have Senator Marsha Blackburn in Kentucky or in Tennessee saying that Griswold versus Connecticut, the Supreme Court decision that legalized the use of contraception among married people, was wrongly decided. We have all three attorney general candidates in the state of Michigan for the Republican side saying the same thing as well. We have a concerted effort to overturn Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage in this country. They're all tied up in the same thing. And so there are no victimless people in these legislation. You're absolutely right. Who do they impact the most? Well, everybody at some point needs access to reproductive health care, whether or not it's a planned pregnancy or an unplanned pregnancy. We don't know how these things go. We want healthcare to be available for everybody. Gender affirming care is not something that is exclusive to trans kids either. Every single time we have people who take hormone replacement therapy for entering menopause, for example, that's gender affirming care. You get breast augmentation, that's gender affirming care. We've just politicized and weaponized it in a new and very dangerous way. But they all have a common theme, and that is a regression in social circles, right? What is this about? It is about keeping certain people out of civic society, keeping certain people out of civil society, and maintaining power of others within. So what do attacks on reproductive health care do? They make it harder for women to stay consistently in the workplace, for example. What do these attacks on trans kids, or like the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, what does that do? Not only does it keep kids in closet, but it creates an avenue for school districts to fire teachers, right? So the dots are connected on this in ways that go beyond just, conservative politicians not liking abortion. They understand that this is a pathway to grab other rights.
Excuse me. The irony is that the Republican Party claimed to be the party of freedom. They claim to be the party of liberty. Mm-hmm. And of choice, right?
Yeah.
You can't tell me what to do. If I want to do this, if I want to have a gun, if I want to, mm-hmm. anything. And yet, this desire to impose such strict rules mm-hmm. upon minority groups in this way goes so against everything that they've been chanting for decades. So is it the fact that fundamentally the Republican Party are white, straight people and everybody else has to be marginalized, ignored? Is that fundamentally what this comes back to? It's always racism. It's always creating that segregation, and that this white supremacy fundamentally is at the soul and the heart of any decision. I mean, I looked at that picture that was published of Lindsey Graham sitting on the bench next to Ketanji Brown Jackson, like they were supposed to be having an informal conversation. I've never seen a man so uncomfortable to be sitting next to a intelligent black woman. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
it was
absolutely.
Just like the body language. I was like, you are so uncomfortable right now. This is what this is all about. I mean, we have to really tell it like it is, right? It's white supremacy.
It's white Christian nationalism. That is what the conservative movement in this country stands for. And the white, the Christian, and the nationalism all need to be stitched together because they belong in the same breath. It is not as though all white folks, even in this space, would be considered equal, right? I mean, it is certain religious texts. You mentioned Arizona. There's a bill in the Arizona Senate right now that would make it okay for governmental agencies in the state to refuse to place kids in adoptive and foster care families based on religious objections to marriage equality, to same-sex marriage. The Supreme Court already decided that you shouldn't be able to do that. Sam Alito wrote a blistering dissent last term that was like, no, we actually really want to be able to do that. Conservative lawmakers read that dissent and said, we think the winds are changing. We think that we will be able to take this dissent and turn this into law. So yeah, I mean, the states where they're trying to do this, those agencies are denying foster care placements in Jewish households. So don't think that this is not about that sort of very specific Christianity, because it is.
Do you think any of the likes of, Ron DeSantis and whoever else, do you think that these people realize that the rest of the world does not operate like this? And that, if they have spent any time in Europe, they would have realized that literally these are not hot button issues. These are fringe, far right, extremist views. And yet, for some reason, being in this protected continent means that, you can travel the continent to get any climate, to get any flavor, to get any cuisine. You don't really need to go to the other side of the world to have a vacation. And only 50% of Americans have a passport, as far as I'm aware. I mean, the downside to that isolationist view is that you can think you're being progressive by, appeasing and appealing to your voters and banning abortion. But the rest of the world has moved on. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen if this is the case, that all of these things that we are predicting and are in fear of, that they happen, and Trump wins the election and America is rewound by, 50, 60 years in women's rights and civil rights? What does that do to America on the world stage?
I mean, I'm frankly surprised we survived with the standing that we did through a first Trump administration, given the sheer power grabs, the just blatant, thumbing our nose at all international standards and actively trying to create and sow chaos across the globe. I mean, let's be honest, the Trump administration was absolutely doing that. I mean, it's horrible. You were asking about DeSantis and what do they think the rest of the world? I honestly don't think they care. I come from a conservative pocket. I was born and raised in a conservative pocket of this country in Nebraska, and folks don't travel. They're suspicious of outsiders still in today. I'm not talking about the 1940s or 50s, today in 2022. They don't like it when people move and don't come back. That is and that isolationism, that provincialism runs deep in pockets of the United States. And not only does it run deep in some of those communities, it's a badge of honor. And I don't know, I don't know how you have a national conversation with that. I mean, the idea was that Congress was supposed to be the place where we could have those national conversations, because the folks who want to be isolationists are forced to exist at the same space with the folks who are represented by the AOCs of the world, right? But to your earlier point, because the mechanisms within Congress have completely broken down, because it is pro forma at this point, none of that's happening. And the media certainly has abdicated its role here too. Some of that, I think, has to do with media consolidation in this country generally. It is horrible to me that we don't have state house reporters standard in every newspaper across the country, in every town, but we don't. Broadcast media on the whole, in terms of nightly news, is a joke. Through Sinclair Media. I just, there is a lack of real good, consistent political media for folks to be able to consume, to stay knowledgeable, in addition to a certain part of the population that's just dug in and proud of remaining ignorant.
And that is why independent journalists, like ourselves, have felt compelled to make programs where we do have national conversations.
Exactly.
And the best conversations are going on YouTube. They're not going on mainstream media.
No.
And as you say, cable news is unwatchable. And it's very sad to me because, I came up with the concept of creating 5-Minute News, just a daily factual news podcast, because when I moved to America, despite having 117,000 channels, there was no news.
There's no news.
And that's the tragedy. There are some great journalists here. There are some people doing some amazing work. And yet, as you say, the way that the media operates, because the dollar is king and it's all about the ratings. Mm-hmm. And, even the Ukraine war, I see them using that to benefit themselves with ratings. Of course, Trump was a freak show. And so they chose to ignore the fact that he was mentally ill. and they took advantage of his mental illness to sell advertising. No one's even had that conversation out loud. Anybody that talks about that in any, we're supposed to, the stigma associated with mental illness is supposed to have, the curtain is supposed to have fallen, the veil has come off, and yet we had a man who is and continues to be so publicly mentally ill, and nobody talks about that anywhere. There's one very good documentary called Unfit, The Psychology of Donald Trump, where all of these clinicians basically diagnosed him. The argument to say, oh, well, how can you diagnose him? You haven't met him. The guy's the most filmed person in the world, you don't need to sit with him in a room to see how ill this guy is. And yet the media covered him as if what he was saying was gospel, instead of just going, whoa, we can't repeat this.
Yeah.
So do we get what we deserve? Is that what's happened? It's hard for me to say because I'm an immigrant, and I don't want to criticize America. I chose to live here. I love it here. But do we get what we deserve?
I mean, I'm even seeing this in the media reports now in relation to the, 7 hours of missing tape from January 6th. Right. CNN is out there saying, well, according to the White House, the logs are fine. As though we should be taking their word at face value on anything at this point. The story changed midweek, didn't it? It was suddenly a story where everything was missing, and then it's like that every day. He always, in the middle of the day, he always goes off and he's on cell phones or which if true is also a huge massive story that the media should not be dropping the ball on.
It's not journalism. Whatever they're doing, it's not journalism.
So this is why I find myself in sort of a constant state of disbelief around the sort of the political conversations in the media right now, because seeing that get reported by folks who ostensibly should know better, right? Who have arguably a lot of experience as political journalists, just taking at face value. I do think that there is an appetite for the horse race in political media, and Trump, particularly DeSantis, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, all of these fringe figures among the right make for great political media for them. They're not thinking about the consequences of and the ethics. I do think that there's a journalism ethics conversation that is missing too. What happens when we no longer hold ourselves as the folks who are supposed to be speaking truth to power? That is an abdication of our ethical duty as journalists, I think.
This is what deregulation gets you. Whether it be Trump deregulating the Environmental Protection Agency.
Yep.
It puts scuzz into the water, and people are unable to have, their basic human rights are undermined. And it's the same as Reagan removing the fairness doctrine.
I will go on about that for hours.
Right. And the thing about the fairness doctrine is that an entire generation of people have grown up now in this country. In fact, multiple generations now, never knowing balanced news reporting.
Right.
Because that was abolished in 83 or 87, something like that. And so there is no, and when I announced that I was going to be doing an unbiased news service, people were like, well, that's impossible. How? You're going to have a bias. I'm like, no, you have a bias. The bias is in you. My reporting is truthful, but the bias actually comes from the audience. Yeah. But when the broadcaster is presenting the bias, then that becomes propaganda. And that's fundamentally the problem. Can we talk about Joe Biden just for a second, announcing plans to release up to 1 million barrels of oil a day from the strategic reserve? This is in an attempt to contain high gasoline prices and curb inflation exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. And obviously gas prices for anybody are impossible, especially if you're on low income, and America being America without mass transit in many places, people have to drive. So, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we're at a bit of a crossroads here, aren't we? Because we also have a climate crisis.
Yeah.
And the climate crisis is not a joke. I mean, it's a real thing. You know, the temperature here in California, Ventura County, it's risen by 3.7 degrees above pre-industrial levels. I mean, it's just like you won't be able to live there, you know. And so how do we qualify the fact that he's now telling the industry, the oil industry, to drill more?
Yeah.
And that the only way to get out of this, to reduce gas prices, he says he doesn't even know how much they'll go down by. They might go down by 10 or 25 or 35 cents. Mm-hmm. Mobilizing the industry to drill more. I mean, that's, again, my hair is gone. I've pulled it all out. I mean, and he's a Democrat. He's a progressive, supposedly. I mean, what's happening here, Jessica? Help me, please.
I wish I could. It makes no sense. It makes no policy sense. It makes no short-term sense. It sounds like the kind of answer that you give when you don't have an answer, right? Like this is what American leaders do in times of crisis. We release oil reserves. It feels like you're checking boxes off of a 1980s, 1990s, strategy document about how to respond to a global crisis.
Yeah.
And keep folks at bay here. I mean, yes, gas prices are expensive by American standards, gas prices are not expensive by by standards across the globe. This needs to be part of the larger conversation about energy policy. I'm here in Colorado. In my community, we had a wildfire here in December that burned 1,000 homes. Literally, I'm less than 2 miles from the burn zone. This is unheard of in my state, but now this is normal. So we cannot, every crisis has a climate component to it. That's the
gas
reality.
Prices have been too cheap in America for too long, though, haven't they?
Forever.
I mean, that's the problem. People are used to paying $2 or $2.50, and they're like, well, that's how much it should be. And it's like no one out anywhere in the rest of the world pays that.
Anywhere, leave the United States and go anywhere else, and you will see that $4, $5, $6, $7 a gallon is normal.
And this is, goes back to wages not rising with inflation, so people can't afford it. So, of course, they get angry, and then they don't want to be told to wear a mask, so they're doubly angry that week. And so there's, this is a kind of build-up of a hatred of government, blame the government. And the right-wing media is saying that Biden is lying, that Ukraine is responsible for the high gas prices now, because without realizing that the oil is a commodity. And it rises and it falls with the world. As the world changes, so does the price of oil. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, electric vehicles have been around for 12 years, really. The first mass-produced electric car was the Nissan Leaf in 2010. So, people could have gone electric. The hybrid vehicle has been around for 25 years. Why has there been this reluctance to switch? I live in California, the sun shines all the time, and maybe 5% of the houses have got solar panels on the roofs. I mean, what is this reluctance to embrace the fact that the planet is burning, and yet we have these natural resources all around us, and yet people don't want to take advantage of them? Where does that come from?
So I love this because you're asking me all about the American psyche functionally. I do think that there is, the myth of American individualism is this, right? That we don't need the government to do things for us. And then also conservatives take that and are off to the races for it because they also actually don't like government. So they campaign on breaking it. Right? They campaign on, if you put me in office, I will make it even harder for the government to do the things that it is supposed to do to make your life easier. And Americans buy this hook, line, and sinker routinely, generation after generation after generation. I don't understand it at all. But I do think that there is that sense, and this is, conservatives winning the messaging war. Why haven't, things like electric vehicles and hybrids taken off in this country? Well, because only, liberals, and there's a lot of like slur associated around that, would drive those, right? True Americans don't drive cars like that. And there's a lot of baggage around who a true American would be in that context. And
So that's a white American, what you're
it's a
describing.
white
is
American.
A white American, yeah.
Yeah, who is, likely living a more suburban existence as opposed to an urban existence, right? You need to be decentralizing population. You can't have urban density, right? That goes against all of that as well. So this country's a mess.
I didn't say that. You said that.
I said that.
I chose to live here. I just want to make that absolutely clear that you said that, not me. Soon it's going to be the case, if what you're saying is true, that the Democrats will be the ones adopting electric vehicles, which don't make a noise. It means that you're going to be able to hear Republicans coming over the hill in their combustion engine vehicle. Yes. In the same way that after a time, the only people wearing masks were Democrats and Republicans were refusing to. It'll be the same with the adoption of electric vehicles, that fundamentally, and solar panels on the roof, that fundamentally. But the thing is that doesn't make sense is that it's cheaper. You have an electric car, it's cheaper. Yeah. You don't have to fix it because it doesn't have an engine or oil or a transmission. There's nothing to go wrong. It's cheaper, and conservatives like to conserve their money. They certainly don't like to pay tax. So why is it almost seems like conservatives are voting for the wrong team? Is this the case?
I mean, Republicans have been able to stay in power largely by having large swaths of white Americans vote against their own economic interests for generations in this country. I mean, there is no reason why all of those voters that the Washington Post, that the New York Times, that, CNN, all of those Trump diner voters, there is no reason any of those folks, if they were actually voting with their pocketbooks, would ever vote for Republicans, would ever vote for conservative policy. They're always dinging them at kitchen table issues that we like to talk about. But because they're consistently, especially in media spaces, running on identity issues and wielding that, weaponizing that, right? There's a segment of white America that is experiencing, societal downward mobility. And that is not the fault of immigrants. That is not the fault of people of color who are in working class jobs. That is the fault of conservative policy, economic policy in this country. Democrats also don't say that, and I don't know why.
Yeah, I mean, this fundamental issue of the dispossessed white working class people voting conservative is fascinating because it's the same in England where I'm from. Boris Johnson has this huge following, and yet he cares nothing for these people.
No.
These are not the people that he would naturally socialize with. And it was the same with Trump. Trump's people are like Jeffrey Epstein, wealthy sex offenders, not hardworking people. And so, and as we know, Trump has stiffed anybody that has worked for him.
He doesn't pay his bills.
And the latest one is the photographer, a female photographer, White House photographer, who took pictures throughout his presidency. And he's now published like a coffee table book. And he hasn't credited her. He used all her pictures, and he's like ignoring.
Very on brand.
It's very on brand. Listen, we have to finish, but I'm very pleased to talk to you, and I'm very grateful for your thoughts and your expertise. And just like journalist to journalist, it does fill me with hope to know that there are people that are really thinking about the bigger picture issues, because we sometimes get caught in the weeds of a story or of a subject. But fundamentally, I always believe that these bigger picture conversations about America and where we want it to head, how we want it to evolve, are just as important.
Absolutely. Thank you. This was a delight. Thank you for asking me to join you. I would talk about America and what a mess we are anytime.
Well, hopefully one day we'll have a conversation that is the polar opposite to that, and we'll celebrate
trending in a better direction. Hopefully,
that's right. Once we've made America great again, we'll be able to celebrate it. Okay.
Exactly.
Jessica, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a delight.
Really appreciate it. My thanks to Jessica Pieklo. Don't forget you can subscribe to The Weekend Show on YouTube or as an audio podcast, and also the 5-Minute News daily podcast, which drops every morning, so you can listen to it whilst you make your morning coffee. And please leave an iTunes review, but only if you like the show. I'm Anthony Davis. Join me next Sunday morning with a brand new special guest and 3 more factual news stories to discuss on the 5-Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.